We have one other change actually. Tom Tague was on the program, and he's actually not here and never had planned to be here. So I'll go through introductions, but Paul Berry is here. So this panel is about the semantic web. So hopefully today you're here because you've either heard the word or you have some inclination as to how you could use the semantic web and technologies around semantic web to improve the experience on your site. So what we're going to hopefully do is help educate you a little bit from both the point of view of the publisher as well as an editor or a journalist as to what opportunities there are for you. And we have a great panel of people here to do that. So I'm going to go ahead and let you just kind of defer for bios to your programs. I'm not going to read full bios, but we are very, very privileged to have some experts on the subject. Kurt Cagle, who is a senior editor with metaphoricalweb.org, here in the middle. We have Paul Berry, who is the CTO of the Huffington Post and had been billed as Tom Tague. Yeah, and we have Peter Ofringa, who is the VP of Engineering at CBS Interactive. So you have some great people to talk to you about it today. So to kind of kick things off, since this is a topic that may or may not be familiar to a lot of you, I'm going to ask each of the panelists to give us a very simple, very succinct explanation of what semantic web is in the context of the publishing space and what it means. And then what we're going to do after that is we'll go into, I've got some questions, some things that I'd like to ask the panelists to get them to sort of open up about some of their experiences implementing these technologies in the real world and educate you, and then we'll actually allow you to sort of intersperse questions as you come up with them. So what I would ask you to do is just raise your hand, and maybe Tiffany can help me sort of call out some people. But we want to make this interactive. I know this is Saturday. It's Saturday afternoon, and a lot of you are tired of these sessions. So let's kind of get this thing a little bit more interactive. So all right. So let's ask what does the semantic web mean to each of you, and I will randomly pick on Paul Berry.
Hi. So for Huffington Post, the semantic web and what it means for tech and news is basically the ability to pull out of large bodies or any body of text context and be able to structure it and then help it fit together with a lot of other stuff, or to categorize it. Is it an angry text? Is it insightful, etc.? So I think it's been a critical part of Huffington Post's platform. Do I go on, or
if you have more to say?
Is it just the definition, or do I?
Yeah, no, I think that's good. All right, Kurt, why don't you give us the next description of what you think it means?
All right. Testing. I speak quietly here, so if anyone in the back can't hear me, please raise your hand. When you talk about the semantic web and semantics in general, it's one of those terms that's remarkably loaded. The problem with semantics is that ultimately, when you're dealing with semantics, what you're talking about is meaning. And when you get into questions about what is the meaning of meaning, things get a little bit recursive and nasty very, very quickly. So I want to make a little bit of a distinction here. Now, I don't actually, most of the work that I do tends to be more along the lines of research and exploration of various topics as well as reporting on them. So I don't have any big projects to be able to show and illustrate these concepts, although I've got some ideas around them. In essence, when you're talking about semantics, what you're ultimately talking about from a computational standpoint is you're talking about assertions. When you basically make a set of statements, whether those set of statements are statements that are made in the context of an article or a blog post or a book, they are all essentially you making an assertion or a set of assertions about whether something is or is not true. And you're also setting up relationships between those assertions. So a lot of what you're dealing with when you talk about semantic web is ultimately talking about the way that these assertions interact with one another. That's why you get back to what was mentioned earlier about this notion of saying that categorization is a part of semantic web. It certainly is. It's a big part of it. It means that being able to understand internal context is a big part of semantic web. Ultimately, it also means that because of the nature of what we're dealing with, programmers often have to deal with much the same aspects. In fact, one of the things that I realized when I was putting the slide deck together is that both programmers and journalists basically are involved in the process of creating sets of assertions, testing them, compiling them against what they know or their tools that they have available, and then in the end, the programmer basically has a program that runs. The journalist or the analyst ends up with a story, a narrative. So ultimately, when you're talking about this, what we're doing is we're moving towards a mode of being able to say, how do we make these assertions? How do we move towards an understanding of language and the mechanisms of language as a means to be able to better understand language itself? So there's a lot of pieces that are involved with that. You're going to hear a lot of them kicked around today: RDFA, microformats, OWL, linked data, things along those lines. But ultimately, remember that when you're talking about all of this, what you're talking about ultimately is this information that you're dealing with relevant to you? Is it something that helps to both find resources, which is in fact one example of assertions, and is it something that makes that information more relevant to you as a reader and to you as a producer of content? So let me pass it on.
Yeah, absolutely.
Sure. I'll try and make it a little more simple. To me, the semantic web just allows a publisher to analyze text, to find patterns that facilitate discovery. So to me, it's all about just making our content easier for people to find and for applications to find. Applications could be search engines, could be search bots, different types of applications. That's it.
Great. So before we get into questions, then let's talk a little bit. Why don't each of you go through and tell us what your experiences are right now using semantic web technologies, and Kurt's a writer and obviously has more of the kind of scientific aspect of it. But maybe let's just start again with Paul and tell us, at Huffington Post, how are you guys using these technologies on the ground? Like, what is the sort of use case for us in terms of how it works?
Sure. So on the most basic level, tagging is critical, and it divides into a few categories when you're tagging. There's a creative editorial piece of tagging that, while it's structured to some degree, it also sometimes should be incorrect. So as a quick example for this, because a lot of what tagging is useful for is SEO, so that Google can see what you're covering well and frequently and keeping up to date with. So not having a tagging system is brutal to any publisher, in my opinion. But then you get things that are like interesting, fun stories we've realized and come across at Huffington Post. For example, when Heath Ledger died, we tagged it also to Keith Ledger, and then we track how our tag's doing in terms of traffic and pulling in. Keith Ledger, which was the wrong spelling for Heath, was like 10x more traffic. Because the truth is, people hear on the radio, Keith Ledger died. They don't really have his name right. So it's sort of not maybe as incorrect as it is populist, and sometimes the populace is very incorrect, but it's not worth it to be wrong in the right way, or whatever I'm trying to say there. But tagging also allows you to do really interesting things. Like for us, it's been great to have these big news pages, is what we call them. So you always see them at the top nav of HuffPost, and also the editors will feature them. And what it allows them to do is we have tools that allow them to quickly look for stories to tag if some new thing has come up. But it allows them to tag, say, 50 blog posts, 50 news stories in a matter of 40 seconds. And then we use a lot of other structured data to say, based on popularity, recency, and editorial decisions, what's the big story on the page? And so rather than having a boring tag page that lists your 50 matches, we can make it look like the HuffPost front page. So none of that would be possible without semantic approaches. There's also, for example, we use OpenCalays to do the uncreative tagging, the super structured tagging for local and for revenue in particular. So if an editor files a story, they get feedback quickly from OpenCalays API calls. They get in their interface, they get a, hey, this looks like it's about San Francisco and it's about Berkeley and it's about Los Angeles. And they can say it's only about San Francisco because it's just so tangentially about Los Angeles that any reader would be confused without 10 minutes of reading to figure out why it was about Los Angeles. So, and likewise, if we can sell auto pages really well, an editor shouldn't need to remember to always use the tag auto. Then we just fight with them and slap their hands all the time, and it's not fair to the process. It's not efficient. So being able to pull back these like very structured tags that says this is about business, this is economy, this is autos, this is technology is useful. And then the sort of where we get like really into it on more tech team level that we're and on the community side is we spend a lot of time on comment moderation. Yesterday we did 85,000 comments. We do 2 million a month. So we use a lot of semantic analysis of comments. It's a machine learning system. We put a minority investment into Adaptive Semantics, which is a small little company, a brilliant kid basically who was at AIG as a math wizard, who heard Ariana talking about moderation problems and started this company. And basically, it allows us to return back to our moderators. We think this comment, Julia is the product. So it says, Julia thinks this is an insightful comment, or an aggressive comment, or abusive, or spam. And depending on the degree of certainty and the load we're under in terms of how quickly we're moderating, we have a lot of little levers to pull to act quickly on something or take a little more time on it.
Great, great. Kurt, we'll talk a little bit about maybe some examples you see in this space as well.
Okay. How many of you out there have read Chris Anderson's The Long Tail? Okay. Very, very insightful reading. One of the underlying comments that that Chris makes, or one of the underlying observations that he makes, is that a lot of the way that we're dealing with information, and tagging is a remarkably good example of this, ultimately comes down to what are called power law distributions. Now, power law distributions are essentially, inverse distributions that say, perhaps the best example I can think of is a lexicon, where you look at the frequency of the word usage for "thee," and "thee" is going to appear, 10,000 times or 100,000 times in a given book. You look at the word "cat." Cat's going to appear maybe only about 50 times. But the point is that if you have an entire taxonomy, if you have an entire set of terms, those terms ultimately are going to end up being distributed along a power law. One of the interesting things that's happening right now is that we are moving into this model where we've moved away from brands. We've moved away from this idea that what is ultimately pulling people together is either the brand or the broad category. We no longer really have a music industry. We now have thousands upon thousands of tiny little micro music industries. And each of those music industries, while they could technically be called fall under the rubric of music, because we have the mechanism of doing categorization, of being able to do a search, for instance, which basically says, here is a categorization along a very broad set of potential terms. What ends up happening is that you have tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of different ways of organizing the musical space. Each one of those ways is essentially a given microcategory. The interesting thing about that is that each of those little microcategories is also a micro-market. When you talk about the fact that, let's go back to Heath Ledger there. Okay, Heath Ledger fans makes up a relatively, perhaps a fairly large set, but it makes up a relatively small set of the total population of interest. There are a number of people there that were very passionate about him and his death and were very strongly affected from them. What that means is that if you look at the Heath Ledger distribution, you realize that even there are little micro long tails. So what ends up happening is that, as I like to say it, the long tail is actually very bushy and it's fractal. It kind of goes off into many little tangential points, each of which are their own little short long tails. Semantics ultimately, one aspect of semantics ultimately comes back down to this recognition of these particular micro-markets and of the concept of relevance. One of the things that Paul mentioned was, how do you basically bring or how do you basically identify something that is relevant to your readership? How do you do things that build it? Well, each of these particular micro-categories or micro-markets, you can essentially think along the lines of saying the content that you're producing is going to have a certain relevancy factor to that particular micro-market. Now, the problem that we run into from a marketing or from a publishing standpoint, from a business standpoint, is that because of those micro-markets, we can no longer basically say, hey, here's the music industry. We can no longer make big ads. We're suddenly dealing with hundreds of thousands of tiny ads, and ultimately it becomes, our readership becomes essentially this question of how many people are in each of these little micro markets and how relevant is the content you're producing for that micro market, all added up. So it becomes a considerably more complex process in order to be able to work with this information. Semantics ultimately kind of help us recognize the fact that because we are moving away from the big brand name recognition, we now have to be more intelligent about the way that we deal with our categorization methods. So ultimately, one of the things that I'm looking at here is I don't want to say, hey, here's a better way of building search engine optimization. That's basically just cheating the search engine, just looking for the best algorithm for understanding the search engines. What it does mean, however, is that if you understand the dynamic of what's happening, you can basically start building your market so that you can say, how can I present my material in such a way as to grab the largest number of relevant shares of each of these micro markets, with the caveat that the larger the market, the less relevance that your article is going to have. If I talk about actors, an article about last name?
Keith Ledger.
Keith, you're going to make me do it. About Heath Ledger is not going to necessarily be all that relevant to most people. On the other hand, if you talk about actors who suicided, that may be a much larger set. So what we need to do is basically use the terms and the capabilities of the semantic web to be able to more accurately determine where these micro markets are and how to basically focus our efforts to be able to provide as much value to these micro markets as possible while still being able to gain the value of having a large enough section to be able to work with. So let me pass it on to Peter.
Sure. And just for context, the parts of CBS Interactive that I represent are cbsnews.com and then CNET News, otherwise known as news.com, kind of on one half. And then the other half is cnet.com, which is CNET Reviews, and download.com. So, a place to go to get information about consumer electronics and software, also places to go to get information about news. Things that we're doing within the semantic, what we would call the semantic web. Primarily, you can think of it as just text analysis, looking for keywords. We analyze all of our content or pass all of our content through various analyzers, or you could call them semantic engines. And what we're looking for is patterns in these keywords, and ultimately just trying to attribute a score to each keyword. So as we look at documents, does the word Barack Obama have a high incidence, or South America, or iPhone, or Christmas? But those patterns are important, and those scores are important because of what we can do with them. So some of the things that we do with them, first of all, is it allows us to create what we call topic pages, or basically aggregate all of our content around topics, probably a model familiar to everyone. We can create then the Barack Obama topic page, if you will, or the iPhone topic page, which we have on CNET, and that aggregates all of our blog content, our reviews, our videos, our images associated with iPhone. And really just, the purpose of that is, again, to facilitate discovery for users so that they can find all that content in one place. And then also it seems to work well for search engines, so that as we create these topic pages, when people search on iPhone, our topic page tends to rank very highly for that term. Another thing we do is we create what we call related content modules. So if you're reading an article about an iPhone or something that Apple's done recently, we'll then suggest other articles that are relevant to that. So that semantic analysis allows us to do that. Another thing we do is ad targeting. So this is more on the business side of things. But we have a lot of advertisers who are trying to reach certain segments of our audience. Certainly Apple likes to target, Apple laptop buyers. So using semantic analysis, we can see what type of content particular users are looking at, and then again, attribute those keywords to certain users. And so we can see that maybe Peter Ofringa has been looking at Apple laptops or content associated with Apple laptops recently, and then allow an advertiser to actually then target that particular user as they go through CNET sites. And of course the same would apply for news. That's mostly on the keyword analysis side. Then getting into kind of what's called the linked data web, or RDFA. One thing we do is we've done some work in micro formats. So what that means is adding RDF or this metadata about our content onto our pages in what's called RDFA format. And essentially it's the ability to, instead of creating a separate standalone RDF document, which is rather complicated, you can actually put this linked data inside your existing web pages. And what that allows to happen is the search engines, primarily Yahoo with SearchMonkey and Google with rich snippets, can then, as they're analyzing your traditional HTML web page, they actually can look for this specially formatted content that gives a little more data or a little more information about what's on the page. This is particularly useful for us within the consumer electronics side of our business, CNET reviews, where, let's say, on a product review or an article about an iPhone, we can also include the editor's rating for that iPhone, or similarly for a Sony laptop or a Panasonic television. When we format that editor's rating in this special way for either Google or for Yahoo, then when they display the search results, they can actually pop up the editor's rating on the actual search results, which kind of helps, again, facilitate discovery, provides more information about the content. And then the last area where we're kind of experimenting, it's way further out there, is this notion of the linked data web, and that's taking all of our content and trying to publish that in standalone RDF format. Of course, that's not really human consumable. It's not human friendly. It's in XML format, but that's purpose of that is more for the bots, for applications that are actually, searching through and finding all of this information and then trying to link it together. We haven't actually published much in that arena, but we're very interested in it because we think it has a lot of promise. In terms of tools, we have a relationship with OpenClay. We send a lot of content through OpenClay, but we also acknowledge that OpenClay doesn't do everything we need, and so we have some in-house tools that we've built as well. One of them uses an open source search technology called Solar, which is based on Lucene. Another is just kind of a simple keyword extraction engine that one of our developers wrote. But we've kind of been experimenting a lot with different semantic analysis engines, and have found that some are strong in certain areas, and other in-house solutions are strong. So, trying to strike that balance.
Great, very useful. Very briefly, I would like to see if Kurt can kind of define this concept of linked data for us, because I think a lot of us are accustomed to these ideas of markup and SEO and how we can do things for advertising and pulling topic hubs together, and that's kind of brass tacks publishing tactics. But this concept of linked data, and we probably don't want to go through all the slides just based on time, but just kind of tell us, what is linked data? Like, if you hear that term, what does that mean?
All right. Let me go step back just a little bit, because I wanted to talk, kind of binding a little bit about what RDF is and how that fits into the whole scheme. One of the things that we're trying to do that's happening right now is that we're shifting the way that we think about object models. When you look at the evolution of object models, they basically all started out, many of them started out in one of two ways. They either derived from programming concepts, such as what you might see in Java or C++ or whatever, or they derived from relational data models. That is to say, something where you have, here is a fixed set of tables, that these tables have some structures that you can define by their relationships, but overall there's relatively little flexibility within the data models that we have. What's more, this data that you're talking about is basically contained or localized in an application. A lot of you, especially those my age and older, probably have heard a lot about middle tier applications and stuff like that. In essence, the purpose of that middle tier application was to take lots of local data out of relational databases and make them useful in some way to binary objects. So this is really the first generation, if you will, of how we think about a data model or a document model. XML is the second. XML basically says we have a much more flexible mechanism for being able to do schema content, where you can basically say, here is a schema, here is a way of defining my model, how I describe a document, a person, a thing, an event, an incident report, whatever. And by storing that information in a usable text or a human readable content, it also means that you can basically pass that information back and forth. You can use it as a messaging format as well as a storage format. So there was a big push several years ago to really get into XML systems, and I suspect a lot of you probably have XML-based systems for your CMS-based repositories in one fashion or another. Its query modeler is a language called XQuery. How many are familiar with XQuery at all? I've heard the term. Okay, a few of you. XQuery is basically a way of being able to navigate against or query against XML data models, just as you'd use something like SQL to navigate and query against relational database models. It's more flexible. It can basically create content as well as query content. But the key point here is that with XQuery, what you're doing is you're saying, I have a collection of related resources. I have a collections of documents that tend to subscribe to a certain type. And once I know that those collections, I can basically build complex queries that let me look at information and pull out a subset of that that's useful. That subset's a data feed. So whether you're talking about a data feed like an RSS feed, like an Atom feed like JSON, or whether you're saying this data feed happens to be sent into a widget that'll display it as, here is a list of items in an HTML format, or here is a table that has it. That feed basically in turn contains two pieces. The feed is a train that has, for each car, is an entry. That entry in turn is basically a little set of metadata, an abstract that basically identifies, here's what this is, here is an identifier for it, here maybe even as be a summary piece for it. But on top of that, it also contains a link to that external resource. So that link is very, very crucial, because with the link you basically have a way of being able to locate a resource, a document or whatever, on the web itself. Now, We've been using these links a lot. All of syndication is basically built around these concepts. So as we're working now with larger and larger sets of content, we're moving into a mode where we're dealing more and more with links and linked data. The data models involved are distributed, meaning that you can get it not just from one database, but from a number of databases. Can pull it in, can do the processing, the text processing or whatever, can generate a feed output, and then once you have that feed output, can do something with it, can generate some content, send it off to somebody else. It's flexible, meaning that you can have different kinds of data models under the hood, as long as they more or less correspond to a set of schemas. But it also, and ultimately, it's bounded. That means that the only information that you can have in that database is information that's going to be immediately defined by the schema itself.
So, all right, so one of the things that I think is interesting about this whole topic is essentially this is where theory, in terms of linked data and data structures and objects and things kind of gets pulled into these sites as a practical reality for tools that we can use. And one of the problems I think with semantic web is that there are so many great ideas, and I'm wondering, what are the things that you guys think aren't living up to the hype, the potential? So, Paul, maybe just tell us from your perspective, how does that translate? How does use of linked data and object models translate for you? And are you let down by any of the aspects of this technology promise?
So let down. We also RDFA all our pages, and I guess if you're talking about letdowns, like if I'm talking to a startup and they don't have tagging yet, then I'm just going to tell them you need tagging. Mm-hmm. For example, Yahoo Search Monkey it would be so awesome if that became a default, so that if I'm just a normal user at Yahoo and I search, that if a Huffington Post result shows up, I've got a thumbnail, I've got a little description, I've got that this is the 4 topics it's part of. That would be really hot. But right now it kind of requires a Yahoo user to enable this extra thing.
Right.
So it means you're reaching 10 people instead of 500 million, So I think in terms of maybe letdown, I'm not unhappy that we chose to do this, because I think it's good for a variety of things in the future. But I think maybe sometimes you should change the way you're thinking about it, less of like, I've got to publish RDFA everywhere as a publisher. Instead, think, what opportunities does it bring? And for example, Wikipedia through RDFA basically has an awesome API to be able to pull really interesting information. So for example, if you haven't checked them out, Aperture has a really interesting little app that lets you dig in and research, and it totally relies on every API that's out there. Zemanta as well. We use a lot of these APIs, and if it wasn't for structured data, they'd be useless.
Yeah. Okay. Peter, you want to comment on things you've been, I guess, less than satisfied with the delivery of?
Yeah, I think there's a couple areas that I would describe as challenges for the semantic web. I think the biggest for us is vocabularies, and what I mean by that is that in order to have an effective semantic engine, at the core of it is a vocabulary or a set of keywords. It's people like Hillary Clinton, places like Japan, events like Burning Man, etc. And what we're finding is that different engines have different levels or different levels of completeness of their vocabularies. So, some engines like OpenClay certainly have the basics covered, people, places, organizations, events, etc. But when we get into some of the more nuanced areas, especially for CNET, in the technology space, then we find some gaps, and that's fair. You would expect that. Word maybe iPhones in there, but HDMI, which is a type of television cable, isn't in there. And certainly, for us, one of the challenges is having those keywords actually normalized. What is the proper name for Apple Corporation, if you will, or Samsung televisions, or certainly, the Apple MacBook Pro. And that's, one thing that we struggle with. And so what we have is competing vocabularies. We define a vocabulary internally that covers a lot of those terms that I just mentioned, and then we, try and use other semantic analysis engines that have their own vocabulary. So in terms of a challenge, wouldn't it be great if there was one open vocabulary that worked across the whole web?
If I can jump into that. One of the things that differentiates RDF from XML, and I think the vocabulary is really one of the key points, is that under an XML model, you basically say everything is fixed, everything is within a given vocabulary with a set of given relationships. Under an RDFA model, under an RDF model, it's not. You can actually have models that change. They grow dynamically, they shrink dynamically. The problem at this point, in answering back to your question, the problem at this point is that we're still learning exactly what the best way of doing all the RDF is. We've had 10 years, give or take, of fairly academic background, and when you get into RDF from a technical standpoint and from an academic standpoint, it gets very hairy. There's a lot of deep level math that's involved there. And so I think a lot of the first generation tools are really not terribly well optimized for being able to solve these problems of dynamic content, or not dynamic content, but dynamic models. And so as a consequence, what that means is that in many cases, RDF as it exists right now is often just being used as, here is a way of being able to store a vocabulary. Well, that's not taking advantage of the capabilities of the technology even remotely. So I think my own personal feeling is that there's still a ways to go before the tool sets really begin to catch up with the capabilities of the language itself. And I think there's some very strong limitations that are still on those tool sets.
Yeah, it's great. That's actually a really good point. So I'm sitting here thinking, all right, well, actually, I'm not. You all are sitting here thinking, I'm sure, that sounds really hard. That sounds really expensive. That sounds really time-consuming. Am I right? So let me ask you guys, and I'll start with Peter this time. You guys work for some fairly large and well-known publishing organizations. What does it cost to do this? How hard is it? What is the time resources? Who do you hire? I mean, what are the brass tacks of making this stuff work?
Yeah. What does it cost? More than we thought.
That's everything, though, right?
Yeah, I mean, and it depends. I think you kind of have to start with what do you want to get out of it. There's an awful lot you can do, with this with these technologies. I ran through a lot of the different ways that we apply it. Mm-hmm. I think that if you want to do some simple things, it actually can be fairly straightforward. I mentioned OpenCollet. There are some other open services out there that could help as well, but I'll stick to OpenCollet. It is pretty easy to actually just post a document to OpenCollet and get back a list of keywords and scores that actually match, and then it's a pretty simple engineering exercise to then do things with that. I think as the as the applications and what you want to do with it get more complex, then it does require a lot more what I'll call customization, and it's that customization, the 80-20 rule always applies, that really adds all the cost. It's that extra 20% of really special things that our editors want to do, whether it's around some of these topic pages, and making those a little more nuanced, or add targeting capabilities. So the way that we've structured this is we essentially have a team of engineers. It's a small team. Mm-hmm. It's about 3 or 4 engineers and one product manager who really focus on making use of these technologies, and it's really an extension of our CMS. Our CMS we built in-house, but our CMS is very good at just allowing our editors to create content and store it somewhere. And then really beyond that is where we get into these more rich applications of, okay, let's take that content, analyze it, find patterns in it, and do cool new stuff with it to ultimately just make it more findable. But yeah, in terms of cost, for us it's 3 or 4 folks and some external relationships that are either free or licensed technology.
Yeah. Okay, cool. So, Paul?
I just think that if you're a small publisher or you've got a smaller site or less engineering resources, it doesn't count you out of this game at all. I think there's still a lot to do just on the basics of using whatever tagging system you're using to figure out what you're covering most and what people are reading most, and look for surprises, look for interesting stuff amongst that. But also, you can actually take things to a really far level there's a lot of little companies with very talented people that are working really hard on this, and they would love to be plugged into publishers, and that's all they try to do is build a better product and get people to plug in their widgets. And Adaptive Semantics has plugins for WordPress, TypePad, Movable Type, so their full disclosure, HuffPost made a minority investment in Adaptive Semantics. Zemanta and Apture both give you really interesting things as a writer. You're writing, you come back, it goes and gets all the Wikipedia data and suggests tags, links, etc. So that's something that they're really happy for you just to plug in, and it shouldn't be more than a few hours. It would be 10 minutes if you knew exactly what you were doing. So, it's take half a day, but that's not like you're investing millions of dollars. And then it's just a rapidly changing landscape. Ariana was just in Israel and sent a company my way called Moodbase, which I also recommend you guys check out. It's interesting. And then some people are doing really hard stuff, sentiment analysis like Jodange is doing, that we're starting to figure out if we can work with them. But that's like really hardcore stuff of what does this guy think about that? And is he positive about the bailout or negative? And who are the top characters? So it's not something that has to be, I think one thing, Huffington Post had a significant investment in December last year, and we've scaled up. But historically, we've been really scrappy the whole way through. And I think that's how everyone should be, is don't think, oh, I need 10 million to get that done. You can actually pull it off in strange ways.
So it sounds like one kind of common trend I'm hearing amongst all three of you is don't be afraid to try, right? I mean, so simple steps. At a minimum, I think Paul mentioned, at a minimum, you're going to get better SEO. Sure.
There's one little note I had about SEO, and you mentioned cheating search engines. Just one thing that I recommend to everyone that for us is like a requirement of everything we do whenever we think of search is don't think about how am I going to get Google or Yahoo's bot or Bing to get to my page, and how can I trick it, and should I do any things like that. If you use the word trick, you should get out of you should just get out. And in the end, I think Google's every month, every day, they try harder to make sure that if you end up on the page that someone searched for this, if they search for Keith Ledger because he died, they should end up on a page that tells them the story of it, even if it was Heath Ledger, But the point being that your the page that results from it, you shouldn't overuse or abuse semantics or do tricks to get stuff. As a user, would you be happy to get there? And then you're safe with Google as well. Sorry.
I think that's a great point, and obviously just kind of the lowest level of what you're going to get out of this stuff.
Let me follow up on that as well. One of the things, one thing I would also recommend is that if you get a chance, spend some time working with applications like Drupal. Drupal is a very nicely defined CMS that includes both a great deal of taxonomy related pieces. In fact, a significant portion of their navigation is taxonomic based. Excuse me. But also includes a number of components for doing basic RDF type operations, including working with OpenClay and stuff like that. Now, I wouldn't necessarily say, hey, make migration, but it probably wouldn't hurt to get one of your devs spending some time on it to kind of get some ideas. I found it to be a very useful benchmark for a lot of the thinking that I've had about the way that you deal with semantic content within a CMS and related system. Another piece that I wanted to add on, and again, echoing what Paul is saying here, remember that ultimately, the semantic web technologies is not going to be a magic bullet. It's very useful for doing analytics. It is very useful for being able to take a look at a lot of information, for being able to take information and do inference modeling on it, to be able to pull in this information and say, okay, given that, what kind of changes of assertions can I make that will give me a little better understanding of why people are on my site, why are they looking at the content that I'm working with, and how can I effectively make what I'm working with more effective. So in a way, it's not necessarily going to be something that's going to give you a lot of additional benefits from the standpoint of your user interfaces, but if you work it right, and I don't know, you may have some better references on tools, but you may want to look at companies that specifically deal with RDF analytics if you get into that area as well, because it will give you a much better feel for the sentiment analysis that Paul was mentioning, or other things along those lines. So you should see these as much as internal tools as much as external tools.
Yeah, that's a great point. Look at it from both angles. So I think it's time we ask the audience to see if we have questions. So I didn't see any hands going up, but probably because I was turning around. So let's take. If you want to belt it out, or you can go to the go to the mic, whatever works. Oh, for recording purposes, good idea.
Dan Gaines at the LA Times. Through various circumstances, we have an opportunity to be with Teragram for taxonomy. It's mostly external user benefits, but lots of internal ones. You didn't mention them. And I think there's another one I'm forgetting. Big companies that give you elaborate systems that you have to have basically in-house experts full-time managing. I'm curious whether if you have an opportunity to get into that stuff, or these newer sort of lightweight options, or even for a big site, are probably going to be fine if you just put a little effort into them instead of these big, already completed things like, Teragram in particular.
So, who wants to take that?
I'll take it for just a second, Gaston. One of the things to keep in mind in all this is that we are definitely moving towards a services economy. We're moving to a model. Where you're talking about componentization of individual tasks and individual processes. So when you're looking at a lot of these solutions, I'm not necessarily sure I would think about investing large scale in one provider. Take a look at what's out there. It changes. Right now it's changing. It's very much in flux. But take a look at different providers and see how effectively they can work in a componentized fashion to be able to build a better structure, because there are a lot of providers that will provide one aspect of a service, but not all of them.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with Teragram, so I don't want to slander them. But it doesn't sound like something Huffington Post would get involved in. If it's that big, shouldn't it be part of your in-house structure? You're going to invest that much time and money, etc. So that's kind of, if we feel it's core, then we don't want to give it all away to one like that.
Great. Next question.
I'm very, very happy that a lot of this is totally over my head. I flew my pregnant ass across the country to figure out where the gaps in my education are, and I have found a giant cavern. And in fact, according to Twitter, there are a number of people in this room who feel the same way. So if you could please spread some love. What do I read, or what websites do I check out to find out what the hell Kirk's talking about. And if somebody could write that down and post it to Twitter, because I'm not at my computer. The Buddhist says that the start of wisdom is saying the words I don't know. I don't know what the hell's going on.
All right, who wants to give some good resources here?
Can I sort of drop in real fast, since I'm the one being maligned here? I actually have a full slide deck. I will make this available to the conference that goes through all of this pretty much from the beginning. Now, the problem that we're running into is that we have a very limited amount of time, and I was looking at this and saying, I have enough for about a 3-hour presentation. We have 20 minutes. Yeah. So I hope that by all means, check out the website. There's one good place that I would check as well is a site called Semantic Universe.
Yeah.
I actually contribute fairly regularly to it, but they have a number of articles that stem from all the way from here is basic semantics. One good example that I love is a thing called tropes. What? Do a Google on tropes in Buffy, and it will come up as the first entry. I don't remember offhand what the name of it is, but it's essentially a Wikipedia-type entry of all of the bad conventions and really strange themes that you have within pretty much the entire scope of media. And it's actually a wonderful resource for learning about categorization and how we build taxonomies and folksonomies that can take that categorization and turn it into something that's very useful, especially if you want to know about, how to deal with bad evil minions or things like that.
What's the URL for the slide deck?
That I will have to pass that on. So
we'll post it we'll get it on the conference site, and there should already be a list of other places you can find more information, like Read Write Web is one, and there's more information that we can get you. Read Write Web. Also, Paul Miller does a really great podcast on semantics and breaks it down. There's several wonderful ones in that.
I believe there may also be a linkdata.org. I'm not 100% sure, but
it's linkdata.org.
Okay.
It's a little bit higher.
Can I offer another suggestion? Just realizing there's a lot of places to read about it. All of us up here, I believe Kurt as well, are big fans of OpenClay. So we've talked a lot about that. Without kind of pushing you in that direction from a usage perspective, they do have a tool on their site called the document viewer, which I found showing people this stuff is a lot better than explaining it to them. So what you can do with the document viewer, if you just go to it's openclay.com and go to the document viewer in there, do a search on their Drupal site, and then when you're in there, what you do is you just screen scrape an article from Huffington Post or somewhere, or CNET, and another plug, and put it into this document viewer, and it will actually right there on the spot show you exactly what metadata it will extract from that content, and that gives you a much better sense of what we are talking about than reading an article. Yeah. That's my advice.
And I would just say, from my side, I think most my developers would understand Kurt. I don't think any of my edit team would. And so maybe, no, it's what you're talking about is brilliant. But so maybe it's sort of, what do you need to know? And from the edit team, I think it's what you want to ask for. Mm-hmm. Because this gets super technical, super fast. So if you're the user of the CMS and you can't do tag pages, you can't see which tag pages are returning the most and which search tags are related to search phrases that are coming in, and you don't feel you can group articles and relate them together, and you don't have anything that comes back and tells you, hey, is this about this and this, or do you want to link out here, then you want to ask for that.
And these are the kinds of questions that a lot of us here learn. We don't even know what the questions are.
Yeah,
Don't feel bad.
yeah.
Don't
Start with the question, so that's a great place to start.
One of the things I found, I've been working with XML technologies since pretty much before the standard, the original standard itself was dry. And I've been working with RDF almost as long. I still don't understand a lot of the more complex aspects. You ask me about OWL and I'll kind of go, okay, I understand what it is, I understand what I do, but can you give me a compelling reason that doesn't require a PhD? It's very, very, very abstruse. I'll be the first, because you're dealing with basically how you deal with language, which can be hideously complex. But a lot of it, ultimately, when it comes down to it, is how do I categorize my information better? How do I make it more relevant to my readers? How do I make it so that people can find it?
Yep.
The same questions that we have been asking pretty much since the inception of the web. It's just that these are tools that provide another aspect of being able to solve that problem.
Great. Another question?
Somewhat of it, maybe a two-part question, I'm not sure. I'm wondering, I work at Yahoo, and so we have multiple feeds from hundreds of thousands of publishers. If I want to scrape that data and cut and slice it the way I want it, and I don't work for search, I'm editorial, but let's say I want to display it, like, let's say by zip code or by, like, my zip code and stories about pets who, I don't know, I'm just making this up, who get sick. Like, how would I be able to get that data? Because you have different, if I understand it, different RDFA filing kind of conventions amongst different publishers, or am I misunderstanding that?
Peter Solar, maybe, or?
Well, I think fundamentally, again, as it relates to the semantic technologies, we're just looking for keywords. So whatever, in your example, keywords might then have, predominance within the article. So a particular zip code, a particular pet name, other keywords. That's usually how, a semantic kind of technology, what it keys on, so to speak. And so, I guess the way that I would approach that problem is, use some sort of analyzer, whether it's Solar or whether it's, an OpenClay or any of the other ones that have been named to find those patterns, and then organize your content around those patterns.
What property at Yahoo do you work for?
The Yahoo front page.
Oh, so you want to target to a specific, like you guys are going to get there, or?
I'm making it up. I'm interested. I used to work for Night River Digital, and so we do a lot of local stuff. And we were looking at it as a database, for example. So I have a lot of interest in metadata. One of my colleagues at the time actually was a library science major doing stuff on Semantic Web. So she infiltrated my mind with all these things. I'm like, oh, I'm so interested because there's so many different ways you can target your audience with great metadata to make it very compelling and relevant. And so at Yahoo, we are trying to personalize and customize content more for the individual user. So I'm just fascinated by the whole topic.
Yeah.
Well, we'd love to build a custom thing for you.
Cool. Brandon?
Hi, I'm Brandon Mount with Saxotech. We're sponsors of ONA. This is our 4th year. And if I may, before I ask my questions, I have questions for Kurt and Peter. But before we start, if I can take a stab at explaining, because I see a lot of frustrated faces, and I heard so I want to try and separate the process of auto-categorization through taxonomies using Calais or Autonomy or whatever product you're doing, and bringing back tags. We all know what tags are. Tag clouds on Flickr, tags on your blog post, all that sort of thing. Let's separate that out from RDF, which is, I don't think I heard Resource Descriptive Framework from anybody, but that's what it stands for. And it's a method of tagging content. And back in the day, we used to build websites in XML. And you mentioned XML, and we're talking about database XML in that case. Now, we're developing websites in XHTML1 with the thought to move to 2. And that got kiboshed by the W3C. Now we're developing websites in HTML5. And part of HTML5 specification is that it's not SGML, right? It's the specification. It says, say I'm a writer, and this is where it comes into publishers. It becomes relevant to you. An example with AP, if you wanted attribution, their model for the paywall that freaked everybody out is I'm a writer, I have a byline, a dateline, and I have a publication organization. Well, that might be my RDF, right? HTML, you know, ahref equals byline, name equals Brandon Mount. And then a search engine like Lucene Solar or whatever product you're using can come along and go, oh, that's Brandon Mount. Now I can go put a huge list out on the internet and find all the related content about Brandon Mount. Does that help? No, OpenCalais is used for just simply taxonomizing content. So if I have a story about Barack Obama opening up a chain of restaurants in Philly that serves cheesesteaks, it's going to go through and find all the proper names, places, proper nouns, things like that are common, and it's going to go and use its database and then tag it and send you back the content with a list of that you can choose to display with that piece of content. That way you can wrap like an H2 or an H3 around it, and Google will come along and go, that's what it's about. Right? I understand.
If I can kind of key back into that, again, I probably should have gone through this slide if nothing else. You can, when you think about properties, once you move to beyond that, you get into these big things. You know, I just came back from Washington where we were talking about a standard called NIEM, the National Information Exchange Model. And NIEM is probably something that everyone should have on their radar because it's increasingly looking like the way that the government basically transfers information among itself. But these big taxonomies, you know, getting back to the question earlier about, well, you know, how do I deal with these complex related things with data that you don't necessarily have control over? The problem with these taxonomies is they are still structured. They are still someone's idea of a model of how this information should look. When you get to RDF, it's unstructured. It's basically, we don't have any specific idea about the way that the model happens. All we know are basically assertions about particular kinds of facts. And it's the relationships in those assertions between the facts that kind of get put together, kind of like Lincoln logs or something along those lines, where you have these pieces that connect piece to piece to piece that can correlate and say, okay, here is one piece of information and here is a chain that show the relationships to this other piece of information. But that information basically comes along as you're developing it. It's something that comes along in an open fashion. So it's more chaotic in some respects, and you don't always have a guarantee that you'll have the information in the first place, but if you do, it'll give you the relationship. That's the real power of RDF.
So, all right, so I'm getting a couple time checks here. So we are about 4 minutes past our 1 hour, and we're absolutely open to taking a few more questions. And people are, of course, welcome to stay and ask panelists questions after as well. So take maybe a final question, and then the rest of the questions can be one-on-one.
Sure, thank you. Really quickly, is there a good way to semanticize video and photos?
Really quickly.
Really quickly, yeah.
No.
Is anybody doing that? Are you doing that?
So yeah, the way we do that is with video, we actually then have it translated into text, and then we analyze the text.
Yeah.
So yeah, nothing elegant there. Same with images.
A quick note on that. One of the interesting things I'm watching with Google is their move towards Google Voice. And the real value, I think, in Google Voice is that as much as it's not a terribly efficient process yet, they actually run it through a speech-to-text translator to be able to store that information. And I suspect they probably also store that information in some kind of an underlying XML representation. But the interesting thing from that is that, again, you have the ability to be able to pull from these conversations, the sound recordings that can then be mapped directly to some kind of a transcription, and from there to be able to do analysis. I think that's really the only way that we're going to be able to do it, short of actually developing very complex pattern recognition algorithms on audio or on video and images, which is being done, but it's hard. It's a real hard domain.
Yeah, like.com does I have the shoe that I want to be silver, and then here's all the silver shoes that are like that shape. And Google's image search thing, actually, I didn't realize this until recently, but you can say, okay, like, here's a picture of a girl. I want all pictures that look similar, but I want it with a purple background. So actually, that's useful to journalists and editors, like looking for the right image. You can actually go there and like, I need it to be purple for whatever the reason, and Google's getting better at that.
Great. All right, so 5 after. I guess I'll call it here, and if you want to ask the panel some more questions, come on up. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.